The Crypto Markets Update is brought to you by KuCoin, the best place to find the next crypto gem.
Wild day in the markets, of course, politically as well. Joining us now to discuss the crypto markets is Bruno Ramos de Sousa, head of U.S. and new markets at crypto asset manager Hashdex. Welcome back, Bruno.
Thank you, Lawrence. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so thank you for being here. And of course, this is quite a day politically, globally. What are the economic ramifications here of Liz Truss resigning? Of course, the UK relative to the US and some of the other economies, not as big, but it seems as if there was this whole view of the UK's situation sort of spilling out all over the world. Do you think that this puts an end to it, or does it make things worse?
No, I think it's a good poster child of something that's happening globally. And, we sometimes, I think the UK was looked at in the past years after Brexit as losing importance, but that's not really the case in financial markets. London's our main European office. We're following closely everything that's happening. And it's still where you have, the large hedge funds, the family offices, the market makers. So in terms of markets, it's still the big thing, right? You didn't have a big dispersion of the British financial market to Paris and Frankfurt, which was, the expectation at the time. And then I think what happens, and we tend to look at crypto and think, crypto, what's happening in crypto? Crypto in the end is collateral damage. Right, it doesn't really matter in the big scheme of things, and we've been having discussions there with regulators, with council, people on the ground on different crypto products and initiatives. And there's always a sense that even if people are willing to do things and willing to push an agenda, there are bigger things on their plate, right? And if you look at the UK having 3 prime ministers in 4 months, we're going into developing country territory. And that's where the world is right now, and not only in terms of politics, but economy, right? So we still have a way of thinking about the world, maybe like in the 90s. The world's radically different today. And this level of political instability is the things you saw in Argentina in the late 90s, you see in Turkey, in Lebanon, and places like that, right? So it's a sign of the times, and we should follow closely and not expect new developments to reproduce what we've seen in the past years in developed countries.
Italy in the 80s, I think, is probably one of the for those people.
Or now. Italy forever.
Everyone gets to be prime minister at some point.
Yeah.
True democracy. So I guess the question here is, can the British keep curb inflation with a new prime minister? That seems to be the global question, is whether or not economies can curb inflation. Do you think that this change in power potentially, what does it mean in terms of Britain being able to control the inflationary aspects of its economy? That was a complaint about these tax cuts being unfunded, et cetera, that it was actually going to create some amount of inflation as well. Do you think that keeps it under control? And also, as I mentioned, the spillover effect. Does that also mean, as other economies look to it, and if there's a kind of a loss of trust that Britain can keep control of that inflation, does it make things worse?
Yes, it does. And I think the question is, are these people in power, whoever comes in, either in the UK or other places, willing to take the hard measures that come with taming inflation? And then again, I keep referencing emerging markets because that's where we've seen this history in the past 40, 50 years. And if you followed what happened in Asia and Latin America and Africa and several places that had, for instance, inflation problems and loans from the IMF, and requirements from the IMF to bring down inflation down, especially when you don't have a lot of control over monetary policy, which is the case now for most countries after printing so much money in the past years, you're back to fiscal. And then how do you reduce costs? And when you reduce costs, you have direct effects on population. So people hurt and they feel it, and then governments become unpopular. And so it's not an easy thing. And especially, I think, in parliamentary governments in which the prime minister has a very unstable position, that if you're not creating direct impact for the public, you have a situation like Italy in which a prime minister is changing all the time. When you have a presidential republic, then the president has more time to implement policies and show results. So there's no guarantee that whoever is coming up, even if they're more heterodox and conservative in fiscal terms, they'll be able to tame it, because it does require some very sour medicine that not everybody's willing to take, because that's a very bad solution in terms of popularity, even if it's the needed thing.
Can you explain some of the market reaction we're seeing today? I'm just taking a look at the FTSE right now. It was up earlier. Now it's down. The Great British Pound against the US dollar is also up about 0.4%. And yet the crypto markets, lately have been very low volatility, pretty much flat in that narrow trading range.
Yeah, we're in that meme of the poking Bitcoin to do something, right? It's not being exciting, and I think it goes back to what I was saying in terms of being collateral damage and this general apathy from investors towards crypto, and it comes from the fact that let's say big investors have bigger fish to fry right now in problems in their portfolios. And those who were invested in crypto was a small position in percentage points. So even if Bitcoin's not doing much, that doesn't really matter to them right now. If they're taking a loss of 15, 20, 30% in the year with other things in their portfolio. So it's a little bit connected to that. And looking 6 months ahead. So I think, on the UK side, this was priced in, not necessarily that she was leaving, but that she had, become a lame duck essentially, and that things, were bound to change somewhat. So looking at, 6, 12 months, the question is, as I think I mentioned last time, is where does the world go with, so much instability, and what does it mean for especially the large economies? And everybody's in a little bit of a waiting mode to see how things unfold and how much is left after the big unfolding. So we had a first pop of the bubble in terms of, you're seeing VCs in the public markets, valuations coming down, but this is still not over. Like what happens at the end, if you get to a point in which, I don't know, can interest rates in the US go to 10, 12, 15%? What happens in that scenario, right? So I think it's still, that's still the game that people are trying to wrap their heads around.
I mean, just zooming out for a second, the theoretical argument for crypto is that this sort of kind of political chaos, monetary policy mistakes, this is all supposed to be great for crypto, right? This is also supposed to be an environment in which crypto should thrive. Do you see that actually happening? That hasn't really been what's been happening, because there's plenty of chaos out there and Bitcoin's just like whatever. But I mean, we're looking at what's happening in the UK and around the world. I mean, do you see that narrative becoming real at any point?
It's not happening now, for sure. This is, crypto is seen by big money still as an alternative asset and, just an optionality on some things. And I think the interesting part of the optionality is, what if it does become something that us in the crypto markets hope and expect and work for? And then I think, we have some interesting data points in the past few months around the US dollar becoming less dominant in terms of reserves from central banks. And instead of seeing just, central banks changing the dollar for the yuan, for instance, which would be, a possible thing, considering that what we're seeing is, to some extent, the decrease in US power and the increase in Chinese power, you're seeing these reserves being spread out in different currencies, right? So a scenario thinking about, 1, 2, 3 years ahead, more 2, 3 than 1. The idea that reserves will be not only the dollar and the gold and a few large currencies, but a basket of some currencies, and some countries choosing to have Bitcoin, if that's happening on the government level, you can certainly imagine that will happen in all, that will trickle down, and you'll see all types of institutions doing that too. So we think that case, the possibility is still there. and it's all around the possibilities, right? What remains to be seen, but we think, let's say, although that's not proven, it's really not that at all. I think the hypothesis and the possibility is still there.